Very good evening and welcome into a very special Facebook Live from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Actually, the home edition tonight, as we'll discuss in just a moment. I'm Joe Crane, the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at ALPLM. Welcome you to tonight's Facebook Live on the occasion of the 157th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address given back on November 19th of 1863. Christian McWhirter, our ALPLM Lincoln historian, joining us tonight, as is our education director, Heather Nice. Good evening, Heather and Christian.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Good evening, Joe.
I said there'd be no math, and I almost said 163 years, but I was thinking of 1863, but 157 that we go back to the anniversary of this iconic address. 272 words in all, but we'll probably spend more words than that tonight discussing the speech. And of course, we're doing it from home because if you haven't heard the news over the last couple of days, Illinois going to, of course, level 3 in the mitigation effort for COVID-19 starting tomorrow. So at 5 o'clock this afternoon, the museum and library closed to the public. And we, along with a number of other institutions and facilities around the state, will be closed for at least the next 4 weeks. So continue to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for the very latest updates. And of course, if you haven't done so already, we invite you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Just go to presidentlincoln.illinois.gov and look for the link to sign up for the newsletter. Not only will you find interesting features about our staff and crew, but find interesting tidbits on Lincoln and Illinois history, and of course, news updates as we go along through the next few weeks of being closed in the latest COVID situation impacting the state as well as the rest of the nation as we head into the holiday season. Well, Heather will join us here in just a little bit to talk more about the educational aspects of what the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum can offer to folks, especially here as a number of folks will have a lot of extra time in the coming days, not being able to do a lot of activities that we've gotten used to in the last few months. So, Christian, why don't we kind of start tonight? And of course, we also invite folks to pose your questions for our team tonight, as well as even if you don't have a question or comment, just let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the state, around the nation, and even around the world. Love to hear where you're checking in from tonight and watching things. Of course, we're going to, had we been in the museum tonight, Christian, we would have been in Journeys 2 in the room that features the sprawling Gettysburg Battle and Gettysburg Address mural, which will be the focus of our conversation tonight. Christian, good evening again, and let's kind of take us through the story of Gettysburg, I guess kind of like any other story, kind of working our way from left to right through the mural.
Yeah, this mural, one of the cool things about the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum is when it was constructed, we're going into our 16th year, right? It features a lot of original artwork. There's several murals throughout the museum that complement the what we call immersive exhibits, right? The Presidential Library Museum, the museum exhibits, the core exhibits, what Joe called Journey 2 and then Journey 1, aren't what we call artifact driven. They're immersive and experiential. You're supposed to travel through these different moments from Lincoln's life and times, and feel what it was like to be in them. And so one of the ways they do that is you're in Lincoln's log cabin growing up, these kind of things, but it's also these murals. And the largest of them is this one. There's an entire room devoted just to Gettysburg, and it's pretty late in the museum. And you can see the whole mural here. Obviously, you don't get quite the same impact that we do when you're in person, but there's really not much else in this room. There's a little bit of interpretation on the speech, the Gettysburg Address. You can see in the image here that it's also written out in a reproduction of Lincoln's hand on the upper portion there. And there's a little bit of interpretation of other stuff, but it's mostly just this, and it was kind of swelling music that combines Dixie and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the two kind of main memory anthems we have for both sides. And so what the mural is doing is it's taking you through the cycle of what happened at Gettysburg. And on the, going from left to right, it takes you through the battle to its aftermath to Lincoln's speech. So we thought that tonight what we would do to kind of get us going is I'll just take you really quickly through these events, and then we'll have Heather jump in and talk a little bit about this mural and some of the ways we can use it, and maybe some of what I hope some of you see in this mural too, because I think there's a lot going on here. So why don't we jump ahead? We've kind of chopped it into 3 parts. So why don't we jump ahead to the first part?
And which makes kind of sense, because even though it's one sprawling mural, it really has 3 components if you focus on it. And of course, we start out in July of 1863, the battle itself.
Yeah. So this is supposed to be the battle itself. It is a reconstruction of Confederates assaulting the Union line. It incorporates a lot of different imagery that is kind of associated with the battle. I think it's supposed to be July 3rd. I think this is supposed to be Pickett's charge, but it kind of looks like, it also kind of looks like the assault on Cemetery Hill and on Culp's Hill on the first day a little bit. And I think it's supposed to just be representative of the battle as a whole. There's often you see these images of a Confederate soldier, a Union soldier using their rifle like a club, like you can see this guy in the middle doing. The Union is entrenched, right? The thing about the Battle of Gettysburg is the Union was the defender on that day. It was the culmination of Robert E. Lee's second invasion into the North. He penetrated into the North in late June of 1863. And the Army of the Potomac, so long on the losing side to various battles to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, moves to meet Lee. It is under the command of a new general, George Meade, who's only been in command of the Army of the Potomac for a handful of days. And they meet almost by accident at Gettysburg. And Lee is looking for a decisive victory in Gettysburg. So much of what happens at Gettysburg over its 3 days is Lee battering away at the Union line as he attempts to, the Union has a very well-entrenched position just south of the town of Gettysburg, and Lee is hoping to destroy that army. He wants to surround it and destroy it and bring an end to the war right there in the middle of July of 1863. And on the 3rd day, which I think is mostly what we're seeing represented here, he has this desperate assault at the Union Center, which has been commonly kind of a misnomer, but we remember it as Pickett's charge, this kind of disastrous frontal assault. And so, but the thing from, but we're not a Civil War museum. We kind of are, but we're a Lincoln museum. And what Lincoln is thinking about all this time, especially by the time we get to 1863, Lincoln is thinking about what this war means. So this carnage, right? What I think, less than the details of the battle, I think what I want folks to think about when they look at this, I don't want to guide you too much, but is the carnage it's depicting, the loss, right? This is the way the artist chose to depict Gettysburg is in an extremely violent moment, right? This isn't cavalry charging. This isn't, this kind of close quarter combat isn't that common in the Civil War. They're usually further apart. The artist is selecting a moment. His last name is Rocco. He's selecting a moment of extreme close quarter violence, because this is what Lincoln and other Americans are thinking about. Why are we doing this? This chaos, this extreme violence, what does it all mean? And we know that the Union wins that battle, so the war doesn't end. I mean, I don't know if it would have ended if Lee had won it anyway, but it certainly doesn't end because the Union wins it. And then everybody just braces for more. How much longer is this thing going to go on? How many more battles like this are there going to be? This is the largest battle ever fought in North America. It still is. It's the bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. This is exceptional carnage. There's about 200,000 people on both sides fighting. There's about 50,000 casualties. About 6,500 of those are deaths. this is a big deal. And so, this is a lot to grapple with, especially for a civil war. These are Americans slaughtering other Americans. And so what compounds that, if we jump ahead then too, is to the next, is the carnage that follows. Gettysburg, ironically, the center of the action, the center of the Union line at Gettysburg is a cemetery. There was already a cemetery there. That's what that gate that you could see half of it in the previous, you can see half of it here, there on the left. That gate is, that was already there. That's the entrance to the cemetery. That was already there. The town cemetery was already on that hill. That's why they call it Cemetery Hill when we talk about the battle. The town of Gettysburg only had about 2,000-3,000 people in it at the time of the battle. It's still not much bigger. It's only a little bigger than double that now. And suddenly they had to cope with this enormous destruction and loss. The armies move on, right? The armies have to go fight, especially the Confederates, right? The Confederates end up back in the South, and they've had to leave a lot of guys behind. And the Union Army is out campaigning, and the level of casualties that happened in the Civil War is something no one was prepared for when the war broke out. So both sides are really having to make it up as they go along, how to deal with this. How they're going to deal with these wounded soldiers, but also how they're going to deal with these, the number of bodies, and it's not just people too. There's dead horses. It's a mess. And so the town, there's a lot actually we know about what it's like to be in Gettysburg in July. This is a humid, hot place. So Gettysburg very quickly becomes a not very comfortable place to live in after the battle. I don't want to get too graphic here, but we have lots of descriptions of the smell of just how horrible it is to be around. And so the town of Gettysburg, with help from the federal government, eventually has to deal with this. And a community of people in Gettysburg decide to develop a national cemetery to bury the Union dead who are there, and many of whom are unidentified. David Wills is one of the leaders in that movement. The idea of a national cemetery is a Civil War idea. Again, it's part of this making it up as they go along. What do we do with a war of this scale? And so they come up with this idea of the national cemetery. Of course, Arlington is the most famous national cemetery now. But they build one at Gettysburg, and they start to bury these dead. They start to treat these bodies and bury them. And they decide that they're going to officially dedicate this national cemetery on November 19th. And so they invite two speakers that day. Yeah, and here's the last part of the mural. They invite Everett, who is a prominent speaker, a Republican, although he's he's bounced around politically, and one of the most famous orators, maybe the most famous orator in the country, and then Abraham Lincoln. Everett, I'm sure we all know the rest of the story. Everett speaks for 2 hours. And it's not a bad speech, but it's a 19th, the 19th century with no TV and radio and all that, they had a lot more appetite for these things. Look at the Lincoln Douglas debates too. Those things weren't short. People would stand around and listen to a political speech for a long time. So they have a 2-hour speech from Everett. And then Lincoln, of course, does his Gettysburg Address, which is much shorter. Lincoln, though, to come back to what I touched on earlier, the myth about the Gettysburg Address is that Lincoln wrote it on the train up there, right? That it was an act of spontaneous genius. It wasn't. Lincoln, we now know Lincoln did a lot of preparation for this speech. And Lincoln took this speech very seriously. Lincoln, as I mentioned, has been really grappling with what this war is about, this extreme loss of life and destruction that this war has caused, that he feels partly responsible for. After all, the war broke out because Abraham Lincoln got elected president and the southern states seceded rather than have him be their president. And so, Lincoln has thought about the war. What does it mean? He's issued the Emancipation Proclamation by this point. So he's redefined what the Union War is about. It's not just about preserving the Union. It's also acting against slavery. Lincoln is thinking, to 1864, which is right around the corner when he's going to have to run for re-election. And will he be able to wrap up this war by the time his first term ends? Because what if he doesn't get reelected? He's thinking about all these things on his way to Gettysburg. And we also know that the speech he's prepared by the time he gets on that train to get up to Gettysburg, that when he gets to Gettysburg, he gets a look at the battlefield. And it's pretty clear that after he views the battlefield, we now think he makes a few more changes to that speech. And we're going to play you the speech in a bit, but I want you to pay attention to a couple of those things I just mentioned. One, the idea that Lincoln puts forth of American democracy as something fragile in the world, something that is at stake in this war, which Lincoln truly believed, that's not propaganda, and that, but that American democracy is being transformed, right? A new birth of freedom. That American democracy is being transformed by this war into something different, something where maybe equality, right, without slavery, where this issue of equality is more central. But also, the thing about this speech, I think, that often gets forgotten is that it's about the soldiers. This is a speech about Lincoln trying to make sense of why the men who fought at Gettysburg died. He doesn't really even distinguish that they're Union men. I mean, he does with the rest of his of the context, but why so many people died? What is it about? And I think that part of it, a lot of that came from once he got there and he saw the place. And we talked about this, Joe, when we had the Gettysburg people on, right? That there's a real power going to these battlefields. And obviously we don't see it the way Lincoln did, because we see the cleaned up version with monuments everywhere. You know, Lincoln, it still, even in November, looked like a battle had fought there. And I think that really moved Lincoln and helped shape that speech. So I've probably rambled on long enough. We're going to cut to the whole mural again, and we're going to play the Gettysburg Address. And I think for those of you who are watching, while we play the Gettysburg Address, I want you to look at this mural and think about some of the things you see in it and chime in via the chat Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or I guess we're on Facebook, so they can do it on Facebook, right? With their comments.
Right in the comments.
We're in Zoom.
Right
We're in Zoom.
comments.
You're not. So yeah, comment on Facebook with what you see. And I think we can have a conversation about that. And then after we hear the Gettysburg Address, Heather will come in and talk a little bit about some of the activities she does in the education department with this mural and with the speech as well. So let's go ahead and hear the speech.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Just let that kind of like a good broadcaster at a championship moment when the home run is hit to end the game or the touchdown scored. So let's kind of settle in for just a second. I think that was appropriate to give us a chance to reflect on that. Christian, it doesn't get old hearing that, does it? I know you've heard it a lot.
No, it's rightfully heralded as one of the finest, if not the finest, speech or political speech given in the English language, and it's rightfully famous. Lincoln, although everyone points out the irony in it that Lincoln himself didn't believe it would be remembered, but here we are over 150 years later, still talking about it. So
exactly,
it's a wonderful piece of writing.
Here on the anniversary of the speech given on November 19, 1863 at Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery for the fallen in the battle from a few months earlier in July of 1863. Of course, it is our Facebook Live from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, Springfield, Illinois. Our Lincoln historian, Christian McWhirter, on with us. And Christian, we already have a number of folks watching from all over the country and already some good questions to get to in our discussion in just a moment. But we do want to bring in Heather Nice, our education director, into the conversation, because Heather, you have a chance to kind of show folks another side of what we do at the ALPLM, and that is the continuing education of the Lincoln legacy and the story of Gettysburg in a very meaningful way for students, even and adults too.
Absolutely. So I like that you gave that seconds of silence after we listened to the speech. I was talking with teachers on Monday, and I had them listen to the speech, because there's real power when you think about an instructional strategy for students in hearing it as he delivered it. It's one thing to read those words on paper, but when you hear them, sometimes it resonates better. I joke that I go back to Nicolas Cage in National Treasure when he reads the Declaration of Independence and says, we just don't talk like that anymore. And we don't. But as an educator, it's really powerful to be able to give students an opportunity to hear somebody speak that way and hear a speech as it was intended to be heard. So I wanted to talk about that before I got to the mural. So as far as the mural, we are, obviously with COVID, we're having to make some modifications, but one of the things we like to do in this space is we would like to bring students in as a classroom and just have them sit and look at this painting. We'll give them some context before they go in, but in looking at the image, it gives context to Lincoln's speech. It gives visuals to the words of the Gettysburg Address, which of course are written across the top. And so, when students look at this, not only do they see the battle, which of course I would argue most of our eyes are drawn to the left first, like that's the first thing we see, right? And then as you move across the painting, it tells this story of trying to understand, trying to rationalize, trying to deal with. And then, when Christian talked about Lincoln, you get to this space where we have a president who's dedicating a cemetery, and he's talking about the lives that have been lost and what the intent is. We're looking at this experiment of democracy and how it's changing in the 1800s, not even 100 years after we had declared our independence. And so it's this, kind of pivotal moment in American history. And this is a great way to give students and even adults a chance to visualize an event from the past, which is why art can be very powerful in instruction. How we're doing it in COVID is very much like we're doing it now. We use these images to do field trips. Educators can book us to come into the classroom and do a guided looking activity where we do talk a little bit first about how to look at art. Many of us have been told that if you look at art, you don't know the artist's meaning, you can't take anything out of it. And there's a lot of literature in the field that actually has kind of debunked that fact. And so when you look at a piece of artwork, you're coming into it with your lens and your understanding. And so we talk to students about how the artist had a lens when they painted it, but you also as a student have a lens of understanding when you look at it. And so we talk about the fact that even if you don't know the artist's intent, you can actually take quite a bit out of a painting like this.
Yeah, and when I'm looking at it, we had a discussion, the three of us, a couple of days ago in preparation for tonight's program. And I will say one thing, since you pointed one thing out to me, Heather.
You can't not see it, right?
I cannot see it, look at this without seeing it. So very much so. That is one item. Yes, the smoke up there, which looks like a question mark, as if the artist is saying,
Why?
Was it real? Yeah, why? Was it really necessary that we had to have all this carnage? Couldn't have we decided these issues in a more peaceful way, or something other than having to resort to this? And another thing too is just the totality of the battle, as Christian points out, that at the time the Civil War battles were a lot of times one side on one side of a big field, the other side on another side of the field, and they kind of charged at each other, but it was a very methodical battle, much as had been done in previous wars. But in this scene, he picks the last day where it essentially is, yeah, there is gunplay in the scene, but in many senses it's hand-to-hand combat, and especially when my eyes are always drawn to the Confederate soldier with his arms held up high, holding his rifle and ready to sling it down uh, to someone in the foxhole. There is a part that draws me to the battle scene, and then of course the horses in the middle for me, and then of course the very calm, civilized, somber moments with Lincoln giving the speech at the cemetery several months later. But the one for me, I'm always drawn to is the hearse, the horse-drawn hearse or carriage up at the top on the horizon in the middle.
Yes.
Well, Joe, something I can't believe you haven't pointed out that is a motif in our entire museum that's carried here, and a lot of the artwork is there is a weather motif in our museum.
Yes, yes.
And there is in this mural. There is, when you walk into the museum and you stand in the plaza, the skies over Journey 1, which carry Lincoln through to his election, are clear, and the skies over Journey 2 are a storm. And we see a reflection of that motif here, where the skies over the battle obviously are clouded with smoke, and then in the middle, notice the sun is just starting to peek through. You can see the beam, and there seems to be almost smoke rising off that hearse you mentioned, Joe. And then once you get over to Lincoln, the skies are clear, and the smoke off that hearse has become clouds. And I think that's a really interesting thing too. The museum does this several times with its artwork, where it uses the sky and a kind of weather trope to enhance what's going on. And
also using weather too to tell the story of the Lincoln family's pain and suffering in the White House, when you see the rain, you hear the rain and feel the chill in as you walk through the White House scene after Willie's death in the White House. But yes, that's part of it. And also, Heather, talk about the prominent use of one color to draw the eye to different aspects of the mural.
So it's a little harder to see, I think, in the bigger picture, but if you look, starting on the left-hand side, you can see that it's here. So it's a little harder. It's more of an orange, but you can see he's got an orange sash here. And then if you look at the red, you're kind of drawn to the flag. And then actually even up here in the clouds, it's got a reddish hue, and then you see the gate. And so the red kind of carries you across, right? And as you come into the crowd of mourners who have gathered to honor the dead, you actually notice there's one red umbrella right here of the woman who's walking up. And so for me, and there's actually a little bit more, like there's some on the horse here. So for me, red is a very intentional color in this painting, because in a painting of a battle, in my mind, you would expect a lot more of it, right? And it's not there. And so for me, I just kind of see the red carrying my eyes across the painting. And it's something we've actually even had students point out who've looked at it, that, these colors kind of draw your eyes across the painting. And, much as Christian talked about with the clouds, color is used very intentionally here.
And of course, you could say that the color red used because it's the symbol of the color of blood, and that of course the blood shed on the battlefield is very much part of this story.
But it's interesting because realistically, there's not a lot of blood on the battlefield, right? And so I think we'd probably have to ask the artist if that was intentional. I think in all of them, you can see there is one zoom that we have where you can see kind of a blood spatter coming where someone's been shot, but for the most part, for many of the battled scenes I've seen depicted, and Christian, you can probably speak to this too, this one is not the bloodiest depiction I've seen, but it was one of the bloodiest battles, right? And so it's obviously very intentional on the artist to not have that. Why? I don't know, but that's something that I think about it.
That's actually not untypical for Civil War art. One of the interesting things about Civil War art, and this is probably a different conversation for another day, is the way that it depicts the war as violent, but it often shies away from the gore. And I think more of the gore is happening in the middle part than actually in the battle, right? When you see some of the bodies. But yeah, it's interesting again, but you're right though, it also helps them use red sparingly. You know, the other thing that's, you know, I think Heather, you told me you had a question the other day about whether on the day Lincoln gave the speech, and it's interesting too, because the scene of Lincoln giving this speech looks like a warm summer day, and of course November 19th is not the summer, and so but that day actually was unseasonably warm, and it was fairly clear skied, so it's actually a pretty accurate description of it. But it certainly doesn't look like a hot sweltering July day on the left. You know, it's certainly the color scheme is colder, but again, that has more to do with the emotions that the piece is trying to convey than you know, than trying to depict what it was like to be to what the air felt like that day in terms of.
Well, you know, and you brought up the battle, how Civil War depictions of art would have been more muted, right? And that's in stark contrast to like the photographs of Matthew Brady that were for the first time really depicting kind of the ills of war. I think in this painting, what I like about it is there's motion, there's movement. Like when you look at a Brady photograph, which we do with students, it's very final, right? Like there's no story around it. There's no context. The art at least gives some context. And we could easily show students some of Brady's photos with this to give them the reality of it. But it's nice with the painting to see kind of in a way that they would understand probably and relate to better what that day might have looked like.
One more thing about the piece I want to say, you know, because Joe, if we got some questions, I'd love to answer them. But one more thing about the piece I'll say too, that another context for it is it definitely references the cyclorama at Gettysburg itself, right? If you go to Gettysburg, there's a massive painting there that you stand in the middle of, and it surrounds you. And it depicts the end of Pickett's charge as well. It depicts the climax of the third day. And this painting references it in a few places. The soldier that we keep talking about, I mean, of course, it only depicts that day, so it's only the left part of the speech, or the left part of the mural, not the part about the speech, references the cyclorama. But that soldier, the Confederate soldier holding his rifle, the kind of fallen horse with the supply wagon behind him, the smoking artillery pieces, those are all very reminiscent of that piece, which is beautiful. And if you ever go there, they do a wonderful job interpreting it. They bring you up on this platform and you stand right in the middle of it, and then they do all this interpretation. So that there's a tradition of depicting this battle that this mural is engaging with as well.
Now, I will add too, as much as we notice the color red in prominent places to draw your attention to various aspects of the mural, a color that is notably missing, and again, it kind of belies the seasons that you think of. When you think of summer, July, you think of, you know, bright green grass, but you don't see that on the battlefield because all of the soldiers that are, you know, trampling the grass underfoot. Likewise, the earth is very barren, very dead, if you will, in the middle section where the aftermath of the battle. But when you see the cemetery, even though it's November being dedicated, the grass is greener, almost spring-like, you know, connotating, you know, better days ahead, you know, another optimistic view of things. So
the
you know,
new birth of freedom.
Right, exactly. So that green is there as well. And you talk about November 19, 1863 being an unseasonably warm day, much as it was today here in central Illinois. but it doesn't look like they had to deal with the wind that day. Everybody's hats are still in place and everybody's umbrellas aren't upturned. So warm minus the wind. Yes, we do have lots of questions here. Lots of folks from all over the country tuning in tonight. And be sure to let us know where you're watching from. Start with a simple question here. Mark wants to know, Lincoln made more than one copy of the address. What number does the library have?
We have number 3. We have the Everett copy. There are 5 in existence. As far as how many Lincoln made, I mean, we don't really know because, you know, some of them could have been lost to time. The one he spoke from that day is lost, probably destroyed. And then ours is the third one he wrote. He wrote it in February 1864, and he wrote it. It's called the Everett copy because he wrote it for Edward Everett, who I mentioned earlier was the actual featured speaker that day. And Everett was raising money for Union soldiers for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, who were organization devoted to the care of soldiers. And he tells Lincoln that you said more in 2 minutes than I said in 2 hours. And he wants to, Everett's going to write out his speech, and he wants Lincoln to write out his too. And then he's going to bind them together, and he's going to sell, he's going to auction it off. He's going to end up selling it to raise funds for the Sanitary Commission. So that's why Lincoln writes it out. And you can, if you look at ours, you can still see the page numbers penciled in the corners because it was the last 2 pages. We have Everett's speech too, and I guess it's inevitable this story is going to come up, so I'll go ahead and tell it now. The how we got it is it went up for sale in 1944, and it had been in private hands since Everett sold it, and it comes up for sale in 1944. And the state of Illinois believes that one of the copies of the Gettysburg Address belongs here in this state. All the other copies are elsewhere. And they're all on the East Coast, in fact. And we decide, the state of Illinois decides they're going to buy that copy. And so there is a campaign in the middle of World War II, where, right, 1944, where Illinois school children donate pennies and nickels to pay for that copy of the Gettysburg Address. Marshall Field III kicks in the rest, and we end up purchasing it for $60,000, which is a pretty handsome sum for 1944, but seems ridiculously cheap for something like this now. And so we got the entire bound volume is what we bought. The state of Illinois bought that day. And it ended up being in the collection of the Illinois State Historical Library, which of course has become the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And so that's how we got it. It is the property of the state of Illinois, and it is our twin duties to preserve it and conserve it, but also to make sure people can see it. And that's why every year we put it out for 2 weeks every year to give people a chance to come and see it. We do it around this anniversary, but because our other goal is to preserve it, that's why we only put it out for 2 years, because we got to take care of it too. And we got to protect it from the light. We got to protect it from temperatures. So most of the time it lives in our vault in the dark, in a temperature that it likes, so that it will remain readable, legible, and that the paper will be in good shape for hopefully, you know, many, many, many years to come. So people can still come and look at this wonderful piece of writing by Abraham Lincoln.
Unfortunately, though, this is not the year to be able to do it because,
Right.
as we mentioned at the top of the broadcast, today was our last day of being open to the public because of the latest downturn to level 3 in the fight against the COVID coronavirus. So the museum closed as of this afternoon, and the Gettysburg Address, which would have been out today, decided to keep it secure and safe for now, but hopefully sometime after we're able to safely reopen, we'll be able to hopefully put that up for display sooner than later, or maybe a little bit later in 2021. So we apologize for that, but another aspect of fighting the COVID. Of course, yes, go ahead.
Actually, so one of the things that Christian didn't share that I love about our copy is the binding that it was in reads the Gettysburg Address by Edward Everett. Nothing about the fact that President Lincoln's address is in there. It's not the Gettysburg Addresses It's the Gettysburg Address by Edward Everett. And so I think that kind of speaks to the fact, like, I love showing that to students because it really speaks to the fact that at the time when it was written, Edward Everett's speech was seen as the address for Gettysburg. And of course, nobody could tell you what it says. It's, 2-hour speech, but we all know what Lincoln said, even though in the book and in the binding, his was at the end, kind of the afterthought, which we think now, would you ever do that with a president's speech? Probably not. So I do think that's kind of a fun thing to share about our copy.
And as Christian, as you said, even Lincoln himself at the time really didn't think much of his speech.
Well, I think that's an overstatement. He says in the Gettysburg Address that people won't long remember what we say here. He thinks what matters here is what these guys did. Everyone's going to remember the sacrifices made here, not what we say about them. It's a bit of a myth that the speech was a dud. It wasn't a dud. It was another speech Lincoln gave. Surprise, surprise, Republicans loved it. Democrats hated it. That's how politics worked then, and pretty much how politics works now. But I don't think it was a dud. What happens with Gettysburg is its reputation as the definitive Lincoln speech comes later with reflection. By the time we get to 1922 and the Lincoln Memorial, they surround Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial with the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural. Those are now regarded as Lincoln's two finest speeches. And that was slow in coming. It by the end of the 19th century, I think most people have started to think of the Gettysburg Address as something pretty special. But yeah, it takes a while before it becomes kind of the definitive Lincoln speech, and now is probably the most famous speech ever given in the English language.
Now, several people have mentioned the cyclorama at Gettysburg Museum, worth seeing if you ever get out that way, and you mentioned that a moment ago or two. Francie comments in relation to what we played earlier of the Lincoln reenactor reading the Gettysburg Address, is that reading our copy, the third handwritten copy, and notes that "under God" isn't in the first couple of copies, and that some historians wonder about the "under God" phrase in the speech.
Well, first of all, hi, Francie. We love Francie. I know her well. She's one of our volunteers, and she comes to a lot of our programs. Every copy of the Gettysburg Address is a little different. That's one of the interesting things about it. Lincoln is editing himself as he goes along, which he's probably the best writer we've ever had as president. And he, like any good writer, every time he takes a pass at it, he makes a little change to it. And it's made it difficult. This is a good lesson too in how history and primary sources work. We don't know which one of these speeches, if any of them, is specifically what he said that day. There's also media reports of the speech that came out at the time, right? What you would do with these speeches. One of the reasons why Lincoln probably makes the speech as short as he did, this is especially true with the second inaugural, is so it will fit in one column in a newspaper, right? And so people are reading the speeches, but of course they differ it up as well. And so whether Lincoln said "under God" or not is one of these things that gets debated, because he doesn't write "under God" in his own hand in a copy that we know of that survived until our copy, which, as I said, is written in February 1864, about 3-4 months after he gives the speech. Some of the media accounts at the time include "under God." So that's another interesting question, is were they right? Or at that point, had Lincoln had enough exposure to the way the speech had gotten into the public consciousness that he either thought he said "under God" when he really didn't, or that he was like, "Oh yeah, I did say "under God. I forgot to put that in the other two. I'm going to make sure I put it in this one." We don't know. But yeah, ours is the first one where he includes that phrase, and the other two after that both include it. The one I should point out, by the way, the final copy, the Bliss copy, is the one that's in the White House. When people recite the Gettysburg Address, that's usually the one they're reciting, is that last copy he wrote. And that's where it resides now.
Well, talking about newspaper columns and newspaper writers of the day, translating the speech, Laura segues into that. Says, one theory is Lincoln gained inspiration for the address from a New York Times article written by Sam Wilkerson after the battle. Sam wrote a story about the death of his son, came under fire at Barlow's Knoll. Bayard died from shock after his men carried him to a safety in a makeshift hospital in a nearby almshouse. Have you heard that story over time?
It's not currently ringing a bell with me, but that doesn't mean I haven't read it before. It was a long time ago that I'll pivot on my answer into recommending that the best book written on how Lincoln wrote the speech and what went into it is by Martin Johnson, and it's called Writing the Gettysburg Address. And I forget if that story is in there or not, but it's entirely possible. It's an interesting story. One of the things that makes Gettysburg such a fascinating place is the number of stories like that out there of personal sacrifice. You know, it's another thing Civil War historians argue about, and Heather, you can probably talk about this a little too, and some of the stuff you've done with education is you know, Gettysburg's obviously a big deal. I don't want to downplay what a big deal this battle is. I already mentioned it just as a milestone. But you know, that its importance to the overall war, it has a bigger role in the way we've remembered the war and in the way we tell the stories of the role in some cases than it actually played. It was obviously a hugely important battle, but the next day on July 4th, Vicksburg surrenders to Grant, which is a far bigger success for the Union than the victory gained at Gettysburg. Again, we're comparing triumphs here, so I'm not, again, I don't want anyone to think I'm saying Gettysburg was not a big deal, but it became the like main thing that we remember about this. Like, if you think about the Civil War, you think about Gettysburg. And so it plays this enormous role. And part of that, Joe, is because of that kind of thing. There's all these stories that come out of Gettysburg, and Gettysburg becomes this kind of cultural artifact itself, along with, you know, being a historical event and part of this narrative of the war itself.
Now, if I could go back to the under God just to kind of finalize that, Thomas chimes in, says, according to the New York Times of November 20th, 1863, the day after, he said, quote, that the nation under God, unquote, has a copy of the New York Times complete Civil War. So if the New York Times the next day said it, New York Times considered the newspaper of record. So we'll go with that. Go with the New York Times. Let's see. And again, getting back to the interpretation of this mural, Heather, James writes, I see Lincoln gazing back at the darkness of war as the darkness gives way to the sunlight, the dawning of a new birth of freedom he alludes to in his address. Because, yeah, if you see where Lincoln vision is looking back toward that battlefield.
Right. And it's interesting because if you look at the painting, the mass of people are clearly this way, and he's looking this way, right? Which of course probably would not have been the case. You've seen pictures that the Library of Congress has. He's looking at the crowds. But you know, you're right. It's absolutely, I mean, if you think about the speech, it is a reflective speech. It is a pensive speech. He's thinking about what's happened on this battlefield and the sacrifices that they've made. And so again, the nice thing about art is that, particularly art that came, you know, 100 years later, is the artist has the benefit of historical interpretation. The artist has the benefit of time to show maybe not what happened that day. And so the, you know, art always gets into this really fun space with kids because we ask them, you know, is this a primary source or a secondary source? You know, half the kids will say, oh, it's a primary source because it's depicting a battle. It's like, well, let's talk about what that really means. And so we have, and then of course you get the historians involved, and they're like, well, the primary source depends on your question. Not all things are a primary source. And so there's all this great debate about it. But yeah, you know, I think the nice thing about a painting like this is because it is, you know, so much later that it was painted, the artist does have the benefit of historical interpretation and kind of the long view of history to depict this event that over time has become, again, as Christian mentioned, so much more significant than it might have been seen at the time when it happened.
Darlene,
the other thing, if I could add one more thing, Joe, to that too, in the context of the museum, that's a really great observation about where Lincoln's looking, by the way. That's a great observation. And Heather was absolutely right I agree with Heather. I should say absolutely right, because we're interpreting here. I agree with how Heather and the questioner out there interpreted it. But I'll add that the last thing you see before you enter this room at the museum is another mural. And that mural is it's a dynamic mural because there's movement in it. And it's Lincoln sitting in the telegraph office, which one of the interesting things about the Civil War, and this, I try to emphasize this when I give tours of the museum, is that This war is the first war that a leader like Lincoln can experience in real time, because he's getting the casualty numbers, he's getting reports from the front via telegraph very quickly. And the mural there depicts Lincoln sitting in a chair looking at these reports from the telegraph, and the numbers, the casualty numbers, are floating off of it like smoke. So Lincoln in that image is looking at the soldiers in like he's looking at the numbers of how many of them have died. He's looking at them in a very different way. So here we are in the next room. He's still looking at those soldiers. Now he's looking back at them fighting. And so there's a consistency there too. There's a lot of really interesting things like that in our museum, that are these subtle touches that are meant to make the viewer, make the visitor think about different things and try and get inside Lincoln's head and the experience of going through the war.
Well, and
Yeah.
the fun thing is that they're not always obvious, right? Like,
Right.
When you look at this painting, it's very evocative. You're feeling the emotions. You may not notice the black clouds that lead to white immediately, right? Like, you may not notice the changing of the dark to the light, but it is evoking an emotion in you. Like, you are seeing it, whether you are seeing it. And so I think one of the things the museum does really well, as far as being an immersive space, is that all of these things come together to create the experience as much as possible that you are there and you are seeing it and you are experiencing it. I think that's something that, not all presidential libraries have the opportunity to do. And so for us, it's really kind of cool to, I enjoy just kind of wandering through the space sometimes and looking to find the ways that the space has been created to help me have a certain understanding of the events of the past.
Yeah, I
to
still
that-
find new things, and that's a real testament to its design.
Yeah.
It's a cool place. I mean, obviously we think so, but I thought so before I worked here. So
Yeah.
every
To that-
time I look at the mural, I see something different, and that's just one room of the
Yeah.
exhibit. So there's a lot in the building that it kind of creeps up and you see it, you're like, I never saw that before. That's really cool.
yeah,
Right,
I'll
and-
give a
and-
quick plug that there's a really great series that our oral historian Mark Depew did on our 10th anniversary, where he did these evenings with the creators, where he brought in the different people involved in design the museum. So if for those of you out there, that they're on our website, if you go to the oral history section under research, and they're really interesting conversations Mark had with some of these folks, where they talked about a lot of what went into planning the place and their ideas, and it's really cool stuff.
Yeah, and to that, I will add Darlene's comment interpreting what she sees. She says, it feels like the left side are the ghost of the past, while those who are living on the right try to move forward and learn from the events that just happened, like we today learn from what occurred in the years Lincoln lived. That's a very good point on that.
Yeah.
And Catherine Harris, who's one of our board members and was on the staff of the museum back in library when it first opened, she points out that when BRC, the company that helped build the museum, crafted the mural, the weather touches that you talked about earlier, Christian, throughout are purposeful with helping to tell the story and evoke certain, feelings and create the ambience, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. Catherine told me she was going to watch tonight. So yeah, glad to hear from Catherine. Catherine's wonderful, and she's a font of information about ALPLM. So.
Well, it's interesting, right? Like, we talk about weather as being something that we can all relate to. I mean, it's why none of us like a cloudy gray day, because it messes with our emotions. You look out and you're like, cloudy gray day. Aw. It's the same in the museum. You see the cloudy gray and you immediately go, this isn't happy. And it's just a little visual cue that even, I work with kids, even the youngest kids can pick up on that. And they can understand that these clouds mean something. So it's kind of fun when you can use art, even with our littlest visitors, to help them think about the past in different ways.
Mark writing in, why did they wait so long after the battle to dedicate the cemetery? Was it not safe for Lincoln to travel, or because there were some other battles after Gettysburg? That's a good question that some people probably thought of.
I can't answer that question fully, but I do know that it took an exceptional amount of time to clean up after that battle. I mean, to a certain extent, the fact that it took until November is because it was just that hard for this community and the few people in it to really build this cemetery, get these bodies. It's not even just, I mean, when I talked about the aftermath, I only talked about the dead. The bigger actual problem for this community, besides the fact like that the community itself has been under fire. So, there's buildings, there's damage, but the number of wounded people left behind in this community that, again, there's people there to care for them from outside the community, but the community also has to deal with this. So, I mean, there's literally a humanitarian crisis taking place in the town of Gettysburg after July 3rd. Or really as of July 1st. And so, there's Union soldiers, there's Union Confederate soldiers, mostly Union soldiers, hiding in, the basements of some of these houses, who've, as the Confederates went through town, that's how they got out of the line of fire. And, there's just all this, like, just really anything you can imagine that this is a kind of preview. One of the things about the Civil War is there aren't a lot of battles fought in towns. This is one of the few where there's actual street fighting. We World War II is full of street fighting. Modern warfare very much is. This is one of the few Civil War battles that's really fought in a town, at least in the first day. And so they've got a lot to pick up from. So that's part of the reason it takes so long. Is there's a lot that they have to make up for after July 3rd.
Christian mentioned David Wills earlier. I did some research on him for the teacher guide that we created, and his home actually became, at first it was where they kind of headquartered things, and then it became the place where they were caring for soldiers, and so it actually became a hospital. And so, Christian's talking about they're having to deal with this. In some capacities, their homes were even taken over by these men who needed care. And so, if you think about your house, if you've got people in it and they need care, they're the living, right? You have to take care of the living first, and you want to make sure they continue living. And so it literally consumed the town. And you said there were 6,500 dead?
There's about 6,500 dead and 50,000 casualties.
So that's 2 to 3 times the size of the town. And that's including men, women, and children, right? So just when you put those numbers, I picked up when you said that earlier, but when you put those numbers in context, I think it helps to understand, and particularly considering the type of technologies and tools they had available to them back then, it took time.
Yeah, I think there's about 7,500 people in Gettysburg now. I never thought of this before. So, like, the number of people who died in the battle is about the population of the town now. I mean, that's crazy. Pretty harrowing, yeah.
Robert asks, is there evidence that Lincoln knew he had redefined the American myth, America as a nation of people rather than a collection of states beginning with and based upon the Declaration of Independence?
Well, that depends on who you ask. So the other thing about the Gettysburg Address is it is probably the most argued about speech Lincoln ever gave. And there are plenty of interpretations out there of what Lincoln did that day and what he said. And Gary Will's famous book on it, that's the one where he argues precisely for that Lincoln redefined what America meant on that day. And maybe he did. I don't know if he knew that he did. I think that depends on a lot. Certainly Lincoln himself is reformulating in his mind, I think, by that point, what America is, what America was, and what America is going to become, because Lincoln has to. Anybody had to during that war, I think, to a certain extent. And I think it's fitting that this speech is next to the second inaugural in the Lincoln Memorial, because in the second inaugural, Lincoln has really come around on what he thinks this war is about. That's what that speech is about, is him kind of ruminating on God's plan. He's bringing religion into it as to why this war happened, and that it was a punishment for, potentially a punishment for the sin of slavery. I think a lot of those ideas start with the Gettysburg Address, and then that's what Lincoln, is thinking about in the next year. And so I don't know, I don't know the answer to that question, but certainly it's an idea that I think is floating around in Lincoln's head that day.
Well, folks, really enjoying this program tonight. Greg says, watching with total rapture and joy from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Greg, for that comment. And folks from around the country, from California to out east through the Midwest, down south as well, watching tonight. And we certainly appreciate, and if you haven't done so already, let us know where you're watching from. We always like to kind of see where these Facebook Lives are reaching around the country and even around the world as well. And before we wrap up, Heather, why don't you tell some folks, perhaps some folks watching that are educators, teachers, whether grade school, middle school, high school, how they can make use of some of the tools and things that you have available for educators to use in their classrooms.
Absolutely. So on our website, under the Learn section, you can find the Educator Resources tab. And in there, there's a section called Teacher Guides. We created a pretty extensive guide for Gettysburg that includes not only images of the original records, but also transcriptions. So for students who can't read cursive, you can encounter it with them. But it gives a lot of the historical context that Christian gave today. Although after listening to him talk today, I want to go ahead and update it with a couple things, which is always the nice thing about working around historians. You think you have the whole story, and then they start telling stories. You're like, wait, we didn't have that yet. And actually, based on a teacher question we got in the training we did Monday, we were able to track down another document that they asked about that I wasn't sure we had. And it turns out we do. So we're working to get it transcribed so we can get it up as well. So we do try to be as responsive as possible to our community. But the nice thing about this teaching guide is it gives you the context that you need to teach it. It gives you the original records, and it also gives you some suggested lesson plans that you can use. And it links at the bottom. Christian talked about the different versions of Gettysburg. We actually provided links to I want to say it's the Constitution Center. They have all the different copies, and you can see which words were added. So that would be a fun activity to do with your students. So that's the primary one for now. We are, as I mentioned earlier, working on doing virtual field trips where we have students do a learning to look activity with this mural. So if you are teaching and you enjoyed what we did tonight, we can absolutely bring it to your class for your students and do a fun activity with them. If you don't want us leading it, we're also happy to give you the picture so you can lead it. So just let us know. You can always reach us at alplm.education@illinois.gov. And so if you email us any questions you have there, one of myself or my team will be happy to answer it and work with you.
And I will throw out, you're talking about how you enjoy working around the historians and learning things on top of what you thought you already knew. There's always a nugget or two that comes along that catches you by surprise and an oh wow moment. I will say, just in the last couple of days, as we found out we were going to have to close as part of the COVID-19 mitigation here over the next few weeks, that it would mean that our copy of the Gettysburg Address would not be able to go out on the usual display as it does every late November, early December. And I've just been impressed by how everybody in the museum and library staffs have come together to put together a kind of a virtual exhibit dealing with the Gettysburg Address, and I haven't checked to see if that was posted yet here on social media today. Christian?
It's on the website, yeah. So we tried our best, and credit especially to Megan Clintworth, our iconographer, for the idea. There's a small collection that you can now visit if you go to President Lincoln at illinois.gov. I think we're currently featuring it under current events or something, just to make sure it's up front. Where we've put some of just a small sample of things we have in our collection related to the Gettysburg Address, including the Everett copy of the Gettysburg Address. So although you can't come see it in person, there is a high resolution scan of it up right now as part of that exhibit that you could open up and you could have a look at, and you can see those words in Lincoln's hand. So yeah, that was a brave effort we were able to build. I want to say one more thing too. Let me just real quickly say, as Joe said, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we all need to be safe, and we're going to shut the doors of the museum. But the work goes on. And so same as during our last shutdown, and Heather's talking about all the things she's doing, we are all still working, and we are all still available to you. So if you need the resources of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, please visit our website And please reach out. I'm still here to help folks out with Lincoln things. The librarians are there to help folks out with the collection. Heather's still doing all kinds of great services in the education department, and on and on and on. So please, we are all still available, even if we're not physically on site.
And those that did a lot of research back during the months of March, April, May, and June that we were closed can attest to that, as those of you who regularly read our e-newsletter. I can remember back in the late part of summer, we published a story about a young man finishing up his doctorate at Harvard. And he was so thankful that we continued to all work from home at the time, and were able to help him, particularly the papers of Abraham Lincoln Project. He said it was definitely helped him finish up his doctorate work. So everything that we normally have available at the museum and the library, most of it available online. If it's not available directly online, our professionals are still standing by, ready, working from home to be able to answer your questions. So be sure to reach out to us. And that virtual exhibit, in addition to being on the website, that will be in the newsletter next week, in case you can't find it on the website, but it should be fairly easy to find. And of course, presidentlincoln.illinois.gov is the website. And of course, you can sign up for our newsletter there. Well, Heather Nice, our education director, Christian McWhirter, our Lincoln historian, thank you so much for a wonderful program tonight. Heather, any final thoughts? Christian, any final thoughts tonight as we wrap up?
Joe, I went ahead and put the teacher resource guide link in the chat in Zoom. If you don't mind putting that on Facebook so that the people who are attending can actually get to it easily. Even if you're not an educator, it's a great resource just for information about Gettysburg. And it's got a lot of access to the original records, which, we are stuff people. We like the original records of the past. We like to look at them. And, Gettysburg is no exception. I was very young when my father talked to me about Gettysburg. And I think when I was like 8, he bribed me to memorize the first part of it. So as an 8-year-old, I could recite like the first couple lines. But being able to come to the museum and see it for the first time last year is it's such an awesome thing. And it's such an awesome piece of American memory that I think very few people out there couldn't tell us something about the Gettysburg Address. And so I think that just speaks to its legacy. And it's really cool to get to work with it and get to talk to people about it every day. So I'm really glad we got to do this.
Christian, your final thoughts?
Oh, I'll wax philosophic a little. And one of the things I think we can take inspiration from in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was going through an unprecedented crisis in American history at that moment. And one of the things he's trying to do in that speech is make sense of it. And I think we can all take comfort in the fact that as we're also going through an unprecedented crisis here in American history, that even, when we wonder what's coming next, Lincoln didn't know what was coming next either. And Lincoln didn't know what it all meant either. And he was trying to sort it through. And I think it's reading Lincoln's words right now is probably a useful exercise, putting yourself in his shoes and thinking about that, we've been here before and we made it through. And, and the Gettysburg Address is beautiful things can come out of times of crisis. And it's a real special speech. I encourage everyone to go on the website and give it a read, especially in times like these.
Well, I said we were done with the Q&A, but one quick question and then a comment to finish it out. And Heather, if you would, go ahead and re-cue in a moment. We'll let the Gettysburg Address, as read by the Lincoln reenactor, kind of play us out to finish tonight for some folks that may have missed it earlier that joined in late. I think that would be just a great to kind of wrap it all up and hear that one more time and let that finish it out. But Tom asked, watching from San Jose, California, by the way, can you comment on what the 4 mileposts that run left to right from the gate to just right of the White Horse represent? Is there something significant about those?
We get that question a lot, and I think we've had different opinions on what they are. I think if you look at them, there's several of them. So I think they're supposed to be fence posts that have the side, that you could where the the actual beams that go from post to post have been removed, and so that's why it looks. You're right. It looks like a milepost, but those are just the parts where it wasn't painted because there was a piece of wood against it, right? Because it's supposed to have been a white fence. So I believe that's what those are.
Even though I am not the artist, I would concur with that interpretation.
Okay, and
We
you
have to
talked.
ask the artist to get a for sure answer.
Yeah.
So.
There you go. Well, Heather, you had mentioned that your dad bribed you when you were about 8 years old to memorize the Gettysburg Address. Sue writes in, I had to memorize the Gettysburg Address in 8th grade. I still remember it, but, and that's why I thought it'd be appropriate to play it one more time as we finish, says, but hearing it while looking at this mural is a completely different experience, and it is timeless. And then she puts in parentheses, and I'm all teary-eyed.
Oh,
And that's what was really cool about working at the museum last year, being around the museum for the first time on a daily basis when the dress was out. I saw several people coming up and looking at it, and you could see it was a very emotional thing to see Lincoln's writing up close and personal like that, and knowing how much it means to so many people.
All right, let me know when you're ready and I'll cue it up.
All right. Well, again, thanks everyone for watching. PresidentLincoln.illinois.gov. It's where you can go on right there to find some resources about the Gettysburg Address. And again, sign up for the newsletter to stay up to date on how soon we'll be able to reopen. And we certainly hope it's sooner than later. Again, our thanks to our Lincoln historian, Christian McWhirter, our education director, Heather Nice. I'm Joe Crane. Thanks for watching our special presentation on the 157th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. Good night, everyone.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.